know. That's a hard number to.
An hour and a half.
And so many of them are out street dogs.
Sure. Strays.
Who's doing the
like
population
census?
census?
That's a good number.
I'd put like a circa.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Here we go. Okay.
Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to our fourth Kavli Conversation on Science Communication this semester. Welcome also to those of you who are joining us online. It's been a rough week. It's a week where it's good to come together and as a community, and it's also a good time maybe to talk about non-human cognition. And we have a really great topic and amazing speakers tonight. And it's a subject that's on my mind because on top of everything else that happened this week, I walked into the bathroom this morning, and not to get too graphic, but I discovered that one of our cats decided to use the tub instead of the litter box, and yeah, it was Lenny. It's my wife and daughter over there. And that got me thinking, what was he thinking? And so I'm looking forward to getting to the bottom of the mind of Lenny the cat, among other important topics. We have two fantastic speakers, and I'll leave it to Lee to formally introduce them, but I'll just say thank you very much to both of you guys. One of you Virginia came all the way from Oregon. Alexandra came all the way from Columbia, the university, not the country. But we're very grateful to both of them, and we're always grateful to Robert Lee Holtz for the amazing job that he does hosting these events. Oh, and I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dan Fagan. I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program here at the Carter Institute of Journalism at NYU. And Lee Holtz is a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute, in addition to being the science writer at the Wall Street Journal and our host for these Kavli Conversations. So Lee, take it away.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And surely you understand that you're now the subject of a cat cognition experiment to determine if you can tell the difference between cleaning it up in the bathtub and cleaning it up in the cat box. There's going to be a peer-reviewed cat paper on this, I can tell. Anyway,
I'm
welcome.
not sure I can.
Welcome to the Kavli Conversations on Science Communication. These conversations are sponsored by the Kavli Foundation and by the NYU Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program, of which Professor Dan Fagan is the director. So this is indeed the fourth in our series. And our idea generally, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, is to bring together a leading researcher in an important and evolving field and an esteemed science journalist who covers that field in the hope that together we can explore how they bring the general public into the community of discovery. Now we'll conclude on December 1st with NYU social media scholar and author Dana Boyd and Wall Street Journal technology columnist Christopher Mihm. And we'll be talking with them about cyber shaming and shunning and behavior and big data, and perhaps we'll explore some of the role of misinformation in social media in the election just passed. But tonight, we're going to be exploring what is an astonishing transformation in the field of animal research: the growing scientific recognition and appreciation of animal cognition and intelligence, how these insights have affected public perception of our relationships with animals, and how these animals closest to humankind, our pets, have become the centerpiece of research into the domesticated mind. So now as we go, I encourage you, this is not a lecture, this is a conversation. Please, those of you who are here, join us with questions, help us digress up interesting alleys. But when you do so, please go to the mic so those who are listening and watching online can hear your question, and also so we can capture it for our archive. Everything lasts forever on the web, or 5 minutes, whichever comes first. So tonight we are doubly blessed. We have two of the most important and distinguished writers in this area and researcher. On my far left, Barnard College psychologist and author Alexandra Horowitz. Thank you for being here. Whose new book, Being a Dog, Following the Dog into a World of Smell, has just been published and is jumping off the shelves onto the bestseller lists. And on my near left, science journalist and author Virginia Morell, who is author of the New York Times bestseller, Animal Wise, How We Know Animals Think and Feel. So Alexandra is head of the dog cognition lab at Barnard. She's been teaching psychology, animal behavior, and canine cognition there since about 2004. She is also the author of several other books, the best-selling Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know, and a particular favorite of mine on Looking, A Walker's Guide to the Art of Observation, which actually I think is must-read for any journalist, although it also will just expand your horizons as a pedestrian avoiding stripe. And one of the things we're going to be talking to Alexandra about tonight, there's a very tight connection between her research and her writing, and she's currently testing the olfactory acuity of the domestic dog through experiments in natural settings, of which New York is certainly one, and also looking in some detail at the play behavior between dogs and their owners. Now, as an author and journalist, Virginia has always been a writer who brings nature alive. She's the author of 3 previous books, Ancestral Passions, which is a personal favorite of mine, her biography of the Leakey family. It was a New York Times notable book of the year. Her book, The Blue Nile, about her journey down the Blue Nile to the Sudan, was a San Francisco Chronicle best travel book. Wildlife Wars, which she co-wrote with Richard Leakey in 2001, was named by the Washington Post as one of their best books of the year. Now, she's also a long-time contributing correspondent to Science magazine, and she's a regular contributor to National Geographic, where her article, Animal Minds, was selected for the anthology Best American Science and Nature Writing. So I want to start our conversation by talking about a transition. So it's not so very long ago. The idea of animals as rational beings would have been dismissed as being sort of overly sentimental. The earliest surviving zoological book, in the oldest book, Aristotle, just said that animals belong to a lower order than people because they lack reason. Medieval church thought animals had been put on earth solely for our use, and for much of the 20th century, behavioral sciences argued that whether animals had minds or not really was just irrelevant, since minds were impossible to study, and observable behavior was really the only thing that mattered. Alexandra, what changed?
As a species, we've always been trying to delineate the thing that distinguishes us from other animals, it feels like. And the bar has gotten higher and higher and higher. You know, was it rationality? Was it language? Was it tool use? And what's changed is that researchers started going into the field. I mean, I think we could almost say that it changed with Goodall, but there were precedents. I mean, Darwin changed it by talking about a continuum between humans and non-humans. But once people started going in the field and saying, oh, look, but a chimp is using a tool or making a tool, then the bar would be raised again and someone else would do research and say, oh, but look, you know, we have other non-human primates doing this, or we have cetaceans doing this. And suddenly that way of thinking about animals, I think, began to collapse.
But when you were a graduate student and you told your advisor that you wanted to study dog cognition,
right.
What happened?
I didn't get a great reception. about that. And actually, I didn't think I wanted to study dog cognition because I was inculcated with the kind of mythology of all graduate students in non-human minds at the time, which was that it wasn't respectable to study domesticated animals. And I've wondered why for a long time, and my theories are, and maybe Virginia have other thoughts as well, that one, they weren't exotic enough. In other words, like surely we thought we knew everything already about dogs. They're among us, they might be in your bed right now, so we probably already know, and we seem to have a vocabulary to talk about dogs. And also, we were more interested in the animals who we thought we could show this special human-like cognition. And that's going to be non-human, apes first and monkeys as well. And so dogs seemed, pretty far, pretty distant evolutionarily. Why would we look at them? So the reception was not encouraging. And I too thought, like, why would I study dogs? It was only after I started studying dogs that I realized that I had to push it through.
Mm-hmm. So why cover dogs as a journalist? Why and how did you get involved in that topic of animal research?
I started looking at it probably around the year 2000. There were new studies that were coming out, and they were making a lot of breakthroughs in actually understanding something that dogs are doing. And I think one of the most surprising discoveries was that there had been studies done. They were trying to show that chimpanzees must be able to do something we do, which is if I turn and point at something, you're going to look at it too. But chimpanzees wouldn't do that. So Brian Hare happened to be at university and starting in psychology research, I guess comparative psych. And his professor said to him something about he wanted him to look at that as a question with chimpanzees. And Brian said, well, my dog does that. And the professor said, well, really? Prove it. So
Prove it.
Prove it, yeah. So that was the first. He did that test at the same time that researchers in Hungary were also setting up to do the same kind of study, which was to show that dogs will follow a pointing finger, which shows that they are paying not only attention to you, but they're thinking about something possibly the same way that you're thinking. They're interested in what you're looking at. And it shows that the two minds are sort of working together, which is something that we think of as sort of uniquely human, except that dogs do it with us. And that was the real first breakthrough, I think, in that field, in your field. And
the Hungarians were doing this early on. And, there had been some research in the UK, too, where they were very interested in domestic animal welfare, and so people studying cats and dogs, but there weren't a lot of studies of them, and that was right at the time when I started thinking about play behavior with dogs in graduate school. And so after a few small studies came out and didn't make a huge amount of splash, but some splash, then it quickly gained momentum after that.
Those two studies, the Hungarian study and Brian Hare's study, they were both published in important science journals. One, of course, is Science. The journal I
for
read.
whom you write, yeah.
Exactly. So those made such a huge splash in the press, and also within the field of comparative psychology. No one had considered looking at dogs, and in fact the Hungarians had gone from being fish researchers and doing a lot of work on fish genetics and very, very solid science. And so when the professor of that lab said that he was going to switch because he wanted to know what his dog was thinking about, and his graduate students had to follow him into studying dog minds, they were terribly embarrassed. They thought, could they possibly explain what they were doing to their colleagues? Everyone they knew were all going to laugh at him, or laugh at them, and they thought it was the end of their careers, for sure. And instead, of course, it opened up this entirely new field of research.
Yeah, but what about your career here? I mean, you're...
Oh, well, it was an exciting thing to write about. My goodness. And this was a field that no one would touch writing about a dog. People, just like the Hungarians, felt it was a ridiculous subject. I was told so many times, they're not even real animals. That was my favorite expression, that they weren't real animals because we had done something to the wolf and we had this animal that would, sit in your teacup, or, you could do various things with it. You could make it into a farm dog or take care of your sheep, but you could do all these other strange things with them, but they weren't serious animals, and they must certainly not be very smart if we could do all these things with them. But it was that willingness really to join us and to do things with us that made them such a great subject for many research experiments.
Well, so let me ask you, all of us, I should ask, so who here owns a dog? Okay. Who here owns a cat? Who here owns 2 cats? Okay. So there are, thank you. So I don't have a good number for cats, but there are something like 529 million dogs on the planet by the best estimate I could come up with. And that means there are at least 529 million doting dog owners. So, we anthropomorphize what our pets do. We think we're having conversations with our cats. We think that the dog knows better than the cat where the bathtub is and what it's for. But, we project our emotions, our feelings, our thoughts on animals, and that poses a challenge for an experimenter. I mean, whatever, we think about the dog as a subject, it's the same problem with the chimp or with a fish. You were talking about those experiments, or with the chicken, or any of the things that have been. I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you eliminate the tendency to fill in the blanks in another species' mental process? How do you demonstrate that it's really there?
Well, I mean, the first thing I always do when I look at dogs is I look at them like an alien species. I look at them as though I don't know already, right? Which takes a stance. That's a stance you have to take to not be familiar with your own dog or with the dogs who you meet. But that's one that you're very accustomed to taking as a scientist, of not knowing. And by simply describing behavior, I mean, my first research was looking at interspecific play, dogs playing with each other, basically. That was literally my dissertation, was looking at dogs playing, which sounds great, and it was. When you slow down the video and watch it at a 30th of a frame at a time, though, it's totally unfamiliar. We aren't used to seeing it that way. It was very easy to look at the dog as an alien species that I didn't know anything about, and just code the behavior, and then look at the patterns, and so it becomes easy. And the other way I deal with anthropomorphisms is that I study anthropomorphisms. I mean, to me, that's the interesting thing about dogs, is that because we already have this full vocabulary to talk about what we think you adopt a dog, you already are talking within a week about what they think and what they know and the grudges they're holding against you already, and who they like and who they don't, and their personalities. And that's amazing to me. And so my feeling was, but that's an empirical question. Like, let's just study that. You think your dog is proud? Okay. How do you see that your dog is proud? Like, can we study that? And I have done some studies about hitting at that type of question. And so that makes the anthropomorphism the subject, as opposed to just trying to push it aside.
Is your dog really feeling guilty?
Right. Yeah, that was one of my favorite studies. A very simple study saying, like, all right, the dog has the guilty look, right? I mean, even if you don't have a dog, you know the guilty look. And so people say, yeah, my dog is guilty. And then, also important to me, lots of things fall out from that. Like, you punish the dog because they've done something wrong, and they should know because they feel guilty. And so I thought, all right, well, let's just test it. Let's create a simple situation where we allow the dog to do something for which they would feel guilty, potentially, and we see if this look pops up. That kind of study. To me, that's great fun to try to design, and challenging, and it lets us have another way of talking about it besides just our default attribution of human emotions.
And as a journalist, you're supposed to sort of be at a remove. You're supposed to be moved by empirical facts, not by subjective feelings in the same way. I mean, does this pose a challenge for you as a reporter, trying to sort of write in a convincing and authoritative way about how the dog responds to a red rubber ball?
Well, haven't written about it.
No. Well, I should explain.
idea for a study, yeah.
So Virginia has written about this research across a broad number of species. Anglerfish,
ants even.
ants, my particular favorite.
And dolphins and elephants.
Dolphins.
A lot of animals that people have different feelings about. Ants, people tend to step on them, but actually after you study them and you see that they too are making decisions, and they can decide how big a house they want, how high the ceiling should be, how many doors it should have, and things of that sort. They don't want to live in an area where there's a cemetery next door with a lot of dead ants.
Ants have zoning. I didn't know
They
that.
do have zoning. They make decisions about all of these things, and so you realize there is somebody in there. And so what I try to do in my writing is to just show people that these sort of the individual side of the animal, and not to write about it in a sentimental kind of way, but a realistic way. This is the research, this is the way the experiment was set up, and this is what the scientists found. So the scientist who's studying the ants, he would tell me over and over again, okay, the ants are doing many interesting things, and he used them to show that ants actually do teaching, which no one had been able to show that even chimpanzees could do. Actually, they discovered it just a week ago in chimps, but they had
The teaching.
Teaching
Yeah.
in chimps finally, but for 20 years no one had been able to show that any animal did any kind of teaching, and a scientist at the University of Bristol in England showed that the ants that he studied did a form of teaching. So, but if you talk to him, he said his ants aren't thinking, but they do have an ability to make decisions, and that they have almost like a flow chart in their minds. And so if they encounter this situation, then they go sort of down this side of the flow chart. How many flow charts do they have in a brain? I mean, these ants, you have to have a magnifying glass to see. So how big are those brain cells? They're minuscule, and yet they are making important decisions. And they're making decisions about not just what they should do as individuals, but how to work together collectively, to put their minds together to make not a hive, but the ant society. So I treat them as, I treat the research with respect. I treat the animals with respect. I treat them as beings that have minds, and I think that's why people enjoy reading about it.
If you treat them like beings with minds, and I'm not saying you're wrong,
Yeah.
but I am saying that that's a journalistic leap into the worldview of the person that you're covering,
Yes, but I think that's
the animal that you're covering.
well, the animal, yeah, but it's not false. I mean, it's not something that's made up. It's not being sentimental. It's not being anthropomorphic. It's not projecting. It's actually looking at what they are doing and why they're doing it, and what they need to do as a species to survive on our planet. And they have a lot of decisions to make, things that we don't have to make because we've protected ourselves from the natural world. Animals haven't done that, except the really smart ones like dogs and cats who've come to live with us behind the barriers we erected.
Right.
The rest of them are out there in the natural world. It's a very dangerous place. It's hard to make a living. You can't do it if you're only going to rely on stimulus and response. You've got to be have some way of making some decisions, even if they're very, very basic, such as I had a really bad experience over there at the end of, say, that a little path, and I had something cause pain to me, and I will have a memory cell that will embed that memory of the pain, and I'm not going to go back there. I mean, that's probably as basic as some of the thought processes are, but they're there.
So want to take a question?
Yeah.
Nice
Yeah.
enough to
My
join
question,
in?
My question was about the guilty dog study.
Oh, good.
What did they do to make what was the task that the dog did that was supposed to simulate guilty dog?
I put the dog in Dan's bathtub.
No, cats
Sorry.
don't have guilt.
No.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so
The guilty dog.
I'll try to describe it pithily. It was actually a pretty simple experiment. I just went to owners' homes because I study dogs in a natural environment, and to me that's where they are, living with people. And so I went to owners' homes and I asked the owner to put the treat right in front of them, about a foot away from them, and then tell the dog not to eat it, and then leave the room. And when they left the room, the dog either ate the treat or didn't. I called the owner back in. As I called them back in, I said, oh, your dog ate the treat, or oh, your dog did not eat the treat. And I had instructed them to please, if the dog ate the treat, in other words, was guilty, to scold their dog as they would scold their dog when they entered the room. And they would do that, and most everybody would say, no, Finnegan. You know, they wouldn't do anything dramatic. But they put on that stance. And if the dog had not eaten the treat, they were to just greet the dog happily like they would on returning from the other room. So that was fine. That replicated guilt and not guilt. But then because it's sort of a psychology experiment, I misled the owners. And half the time, when the dog... Oh,
it's a psychology experiment, so it involved lying.
Exactly. There's always some deception. So half the time when the dog was guilty, I told the owners that the dog had not eaten the treat. And so with this guilty dog, the owner comes in and thinks that they've been good. So they would, greet them. And half the time when the dog actually was innocent, I told them that the dog was guilty. And this is where I'm going to get the big sigh. Yeah. And then some people would come in and scold their dogs. And unfairly. And then I basically coded how much of the guilty look I saw in all of those conditions. And the guilty look was described to me by owners and by previous research as having various components. And I saw a lot of this guilty look when the owners scolded. No matter what, whether the dog had eaten the treat or not. In other words, it was a reaction to or anticipation of a scolding, and I consider it a kind of submissive behavior that they put on and learn to put on. Dogs don't put this on the first week you get them. They learn, they put that face on, and we treat them better. So it's actually adaptive, but it doesn't map, that look doesn't map to when they're guilty. Right. That look maps to, it's something they learned about us. And so then I get half the people will say like, oh yeah, but my dog is actually guilty. And so then a woman who worked with me for many years in my dog lab, who was then at Hungary, Julie Hecht, who is here tonight, did a follow-up with some of the Hungarians where she did a similar construction and replicated the results of the experiment. She also asked some of the people in a subcondition to guess whether the dog was guilty before they came in the room. This is, and they guessed it like 50%. So in other words, randomly, once in a while, your dog will look guilty, you'll think they're guilty, and they actually did something wrong, but most of the time they're just reacting.
Do dogs have an expression for indignation?
Right, the ones who were innocent but scolded did show the most guilty look, so there's something interesting there.
Okay, yeah. We have a question here, and then I have something I want to pursue.
Yes, so you described how early in your career you had met with a lot of resistance, and then obviously nowadays there's a lot more open-mindedness in regards to animal cognition. So I'm wondering, do you still think there's a controversy today surrounding what we see and what we don't see in anthropomorphism?
Sure, definitely there is. Yeah, and I don't even think the resistance is entirely gone in academia. Studying, although happily the public has accepted dog cognition as a true science and looks at our research as represented by Virginia and others and is excited about that and interacts differently based on the research, which is great. It's not obvious to me that academia even accepts all the time dog cognition. There's a lot of resistance there, and I think it's still because of this different place domesticated animals have in science, in the animal kingdom, and in why we're asking the questions we're asking. So many of the questions come from human psychology, where we're interested in why we are the way we are, and so we're interested in animals as a reflection of that in some way. And insofar as dogs might not be a reflection of it in that traditional way, they are in some other way. I think so there are some people who are uninterested.
I want to follow up and explore that for a minute with both of you, and I want to be careful. I don't want to be too offensive, but let's be real. We're talking about people and their pets.
A little offensive.
So we're talking about a big gullibility quotient. You know, we're talking about a big. I'm already involved. I already have an emotional. I love my pets deeply, and my children think that I like them more, perhaps, than. But I wonder if there is not a certain predisposition in this audience, either as a journalist who is writing to this audience, or as a researcher who is mining a vein, but also writing for this audience. I mean, do you worry that the public embraces this too quickly? Just like they embrace a lot of other things about pets that may or may not be true. Pack theory, I'm the alpha dog. I mean, all this kind of stuff about wolves that may or may not have anything to do with domestic dogs. I mean, do you feel as a journalist, do you feel a little sheepish, if I can do a little cross-species thing here?
Well, no, not in my own writing, the way that I have written about the field of whether it's dog cognition, or even more recently I wrote about bumblebees, and bumblebees can actually experience feeling, well, they were careful not to use feelings, but they could enter an emotional state of optimism. They could have happy bees, and someone else had previously done a study that showed that honeybees could also be depressed. So, and that affects how they decide, or how much energy they put into going out and looking for food. So if you look at this from an evolutionary standpoint, then it makes sense, because it's just as with pain or having a bad experience somewhere, it makes sense that these kind of states that you have, if they produce something like it will make you more energetic, and you're going to go out and look for more food, then that's something that's going to be preserved in our lineage of animals, and it's going to probably be built on and expanded and developed until we reach ourselves, and we're always, not always, but we can be very sunny. We like to think of ourselves as uniquely happy, or that we have a unique form of happiness or laughter or something. And so what's interesting to me are the people who are then filling that in and showing that maybe our feelings are not so unique. Maybe other animals don't feel guilty, but there are certain basic emotions that have probably started off very early in the evolution of animals on the planet, whether they're invertebrates or mammals, elephants, and more sentient beings such as ourselves. But there is a continuum of it, and to me that's just puts us in the animal kingdom, which is where we belong. It's not that you want to look. There is such an emphasis on this gap that supposedly separates us from other species. And so what this research has done is to narrow that gap. And I was just looking this evening to see, who still thinks there is a gap and who doesn't. It's primarily among the psychologists, less so among evolutionary biologists. And the psychologists, the most recent was that, well, humans are the only species that has an imagination. And I thought that is remarkable, because I know my dog.
Well, all right, exactly. You see, and now we've come round to my question. So
exactly, but I know it.
You know it. So how come?
And in fact, I talked to Adam Miklosi, the leading dog researcher in Hungary, exactly about why I suspected that my dog had an imagination. And he said, it was a really good insight, and he was going to use it as the basis of an experiment.
Yeah. Isn't that what they call priming? Isn't that I mean, you're predisposed. No, so but it's a serious question, and not because I question your research, or because I question the research with the ants and the fish and the cats and the dogs. Well, actually, not so many cats, but the dogs. And we'll get to that.
Cats are catching up. Yeah.
But there is this, I think, tendency in certain areas of research, when they're being communicated to the public, where however cautious you may think you're being, the public is going to run with it and do what you just did. And I appreciate you're offering us a case study right there. But does that bug you at all? Does that make you refuse to call the bees happy, say they're experiencing a state of optimism?
I have a cautiousness of a scientist, I think. I think I'm more skeptical of my own work and the conclusions that I could draw from it than probably anybody in my audience. And all of my writing is infused with but this is just one study, or this is the limitation of this, or we could call it this, but this is but we don't have a complete picture of it. And and although I'll even write about one study, I feel like it's strange to even ever write about one study. It's just one study that could, we could concoct plenty of studies that seem to show something but show nothing. So I feel like I'm deeply skeptical, and that is probably in all of my work. But it's great that people want to read about dogs, and because then they'll read this work. Otherwise, it just gets housed in these journals that 17 people read, and this way it's getting distributed and discussed. And if some people say at the end of talking about my guilty look, well, the dogs really don't have guilt, or which I didn't prove, or my dog really is guilty, at least they've started talking about it and thinking about it. For me, the idea is to convey the approach of a scientific approach to something which we think we know about already, but we haven't examined. And so that's what I try to push, and at least the conversation gets opened.
So I want to get the question, but I would just like to follow up quickly with, so far we've been sort of treating Virginia as if she's the journalist here and the writer, and you're the scientist, which, yes. But you chose at a certain point to kind of cross over a line that many scientists are kind of reluctant to stick their toe over, which is you starting to talk directly to the public about what you do. You started to decided to write about it for a general audience. What on earth was going through your mind?
Well, it's the right subject for it, right? I mean, this field of dog cognition had grown a huge amount maybe I began in about 99 and up through about 2006 or something when I started thinking about writing a book. And I thought, well, this is, people who know me want to talk to me about their dogs on the basis of my ostensible now expertise about everything about dogs. So why don't I just put together what we know so far and try to form a new picture of the dog based on the research? So that seemed like an automatic step. And I liked writing, and it was so much more fun than writing a dissertation or writing a piece for a journal. You can really talk. I can have stories of my dog in there, and that's legitimate. That's going to be people's connection to the research. So it was an easy, I didn't think about it all along, but once I realized it was an easy step to take.
Many scientists feel reluctant to kind of take that step because they think that will somehow undercut their credibility.
I don't care about my credibility.
If they're caught seeking public attention. You don't care?
Oh, I'm sure there are plenty of academics who think, what is she doing writing these books? But it doesn't matter to me, no. I mean, I do my research because I like doing my research. I write the papers because I like corresponding with that community, and I write books because I like to talk to people about dogs and convey what otherwise would be squirreled up in these journals.
We have a number of questions here. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, no problem. Hi.
Hi.
So both of you have kind of maybe gotten on the fringe of this, because Virginia, you were talking about how you are careful to say bees emote but not necessarily have feelings.
Yeah.
Or you talk about how you can talk to the general public about your dog, but maybe my point is, my question is that, do you feel like either of you, your work has brought you closer to certain animal rights organizations? Or on the flip side, have either of you been approached by these organizations and been asked, take our side on this?
Yeah, excellent question.
I haven't been asked to take a side. I was told one of the first talks that I was giving about animal lives was at Powell's bookstore in Portland, Oregon. And a vegan group invited me to a big potluck after. I wasn't able to attend, but I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have all these vegans in my audience. And so I had actually purchased as a writer, I had a little leather jacket I was going to wear. No leather jacket. I hope they don't look at my shoes too closely. So, yeah, you're sensitive to it, I think, and sensitive to people's concerns about what does it mean when you say that animals have thoughts and emotions, and what do you do about that, and how are we going to treat them? And I always discuss that at the end of my talks, because these are genuine issues, and they are changing. Just recently in the last election, Massachusetts, they passed a new law about how you can and cannot treat farm animals. They haven't gone as far as chickens, which still aren't completely considered to be animals, but by people, I guess, passing the laws. But the recognition of animals as sentient beings is being felt by people, and so you have to respond to it, and you can't just pretend that what you're writing doesn't affect your readers or the organizations that they belong to, or maybe, hopefully, the way that we treat animals in the wild and on farm and biomedical research. That's a big one for me.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
So
I haven't been approached really, but I kind of wish they would approach me. I feel like this research is highly relevant
Yeah.
to the question. It just is. That's the way we're going to be able to decide it, as long as we're a society that honors science and believes in science. So I feel like it's entirely relevant.
It is.
Go.
Yeah.
Hi. So it's funny, I'm actually an animal rights activist. I watched a documentary on PBS.
That was so quick.
Is it? I can't remember the name of it, but I think it was the experiment that you're talking about with the guilty.
Uh-huh.
I actually remember
Maybe
having
Nova.
a kind of moment where I was frustrated watching it because I thought the dog didn't necessarily have to be guilty because obviously the dog knows that the guardian is actually upset with them. So it seems to me that it could be a more complex emotion than guilt. It could actually be, hey, I've upset my guardian who I love and care about, and that's why they have that look, that expression on their face. And I actually started an email to you to bring that up, but then I never sent it.
But that is what they proved. That's what it was showing.
That it was more like a complex.
No, I was trying to question whether that was obviously guilt. And the whole study was about saying, it's not obviously guilt. It's a response to the owner. That's the conclusion. So
Okay,
yes,
well,
that
yeah,
is the
that's-
conclusion.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yay.
It's been bugging me for a while.
Yeah. Go right behind you.
Hi, my question is about decision-making versus instinct. So
Okay.
I grew up on a ranch with a lot of animals, and then in the city I've continued to work with animals, and my experience is that I've found that when animals can exercise their instinct, and dogs particularly what they've been bred down to, the aggression in terriers, or the pleasing in retrievers, or that sort of a thing, that they have a little more space to make decisions and kind of have more of a, just interaction conversation with you. But I found in the city, when I work with animals that don't have the option to exercise their instinct, that their responses a lot of times are masked in their need to exercise their instinct as opposed to cognitive response, like decisions that they've made on how they're going to respond to you. So I'm just wondering if you guys ever discussed that, or if you have any.
Well, in the cognitive literature, you're using instinct in a slightly different way than I'm familiar with it. I mean, you're sort of saying what they're bred to do, in other words, their work. And in the cognitive literature, instinct is kind of placed against cognitive behavior. So you have the things which you reflexively do, and then you have the things which you're thinking about and ruminate on. And it's not exactly a false dichotomy, but I don't know if it's helpful for us understanding why animals are doing what they're doing. But what you seem to be reflecting is more sort of what, at least in the case with dogs or other animals bred for a specific purpose, domesticated animals, something that they are bred to do and then cannot enact that might lead to other behaviors, maybe inability to make decisions for themselves, or misbehavior in the case of dogs and so forth. I think that's certainly the case. I mean, we misunderstand what it meant to have bred dogs to do certain tasks or animals to play a certain role, and then put them in a different context and expect them to be infinitely flexible in that context, and they are certainly not.
So,
I think-
please go ahead.
I was just going to say that actually the term instinct is not well defined at all. It's kind of used as a catch-all for what we think animals are doing, that they somehow do everything by instinct. And I think of it as a kind of a shorthand way of thinking, that they have, through evolution, they have achieved a point where there's certain decisions that they can make very, very quickly, and that to us looks like an instinct. It's something that we aspire to if we want to go, say, play a piano concerto in front of an audience. We certainly don't want to look like we're thinking about it or practicing. We want to look like it's an instinct. So we have these two attitudes towards what an instinct is, and it's certainly not defined biologically as to what it's supposed to be. But in talking to researchers, it seems like it's almost just a really quick, fast way of thinking. So it's not that it's not thinking, it's just a speeded up form of it. a decision you have to make at that instant.
Well, it would be unmediated by reflection, is what I would think. So maybe there's no frontal lobe involved if you're talking about animals that have frontal lobes.
Right.
But that also allows us to distinguish animals that don't have frontal lobes, like ants, and say that their behavior might be better described as instinctive behavior and less cognitive behavior. But I don't think it is a helpful dichotomy anymore.
Maybe it's not helpful, but there is a distinction in there somewhere that perhaps is useful. In Animal-Wise, you were right about dolphin research, which has got a rich and colorful history.
Yes.
And you talk about the educated dolphin and the wild mind of dolphins. I mean, is that the kind of distinction that we're getting at here? The wild mind versus the domesticated mind, or the...
In that case, there were researchers who brought dolphins in from the wild when they were youngsters and raised them in order to be able to work with them and communicate with them so they could ask them particular questions. They developed a kind of a sign language so they could have dolphins do things and perhaps show how their minds worked. Wild dolphins, of course, that's not what they're doing. So why do dolphins, for instance, why can they imitate someone's behavior, the way a person, say, sits, and a dolphin will sit imitating that? Why do dolphins imitate us? What are they doing in the wild that would make them have this ability to imitate? And so that's where the wild research comes in, is to see why do you have that behavior? What is the evolutionary purpose of it? What is the adaptive reason that you have it? Certainly not to anything to do with us, even though people like to think that somehow dolphins want to swim with us. I don't think there's any evidence. I would say absolutely don't swim with the dolphins. Leave them alone, because they have their own societies, and the decisions that they are making tend to be more about males bonding together and trying to capture females. And so one of the things males do is to match one another's behavior, and they form really strong, tight bonds that way that enable them to go out and capture a female and keep her with them against her will. You see, dolphins are the thugs of the sea.
Thugs of the sea. You, sir.
I'm not really aware what the origin of this was, but I believe it was an area of research called natural harmonics, where they examined like the sound of bees and growling dogs and cats and all kinds of sources of different animals, where they would say, hey, that bee sounds angry, and they would then find these groupings of tones that apparently are universal, and then they would find behaviors and colors and where animals could show this. So it would go apparently all the way down, the at least to, like I say, insects, where you would denote that these animals are expressing emotions. Is that been true for your research, that you're finding clearly along the whole gambit, essentially, they clearly have a full or a largely full emotional existence?
So make sure I understand your question there. Are they using sound in an intelligent way to express emotion? Is that your question?
I think that we would slip into that area that we're not sure about, such as instinct or just a response to stimulus.
Give it a shot, Virginia.
There is research that shows that animals tend to sort of universally use lower sounds to communicate. Either they want to dominate someone, or or they're angry about something. There's lower sounds are usually a sound of a threat or an angry bee, even. So there is that kind of universality of sounds, and it is again something that probably evolved early in the evolution of animals. And it works well, and so we continue to use it. And it may have something to do with the physics of the way the world works as well, and what kind of sound carries. And
it seems that it also that it seems to have carried in other areas. Like we look at certain color groups that, like, that black and yellow, that apparently is communicating danger, and it seems to be, it's like an animal suddenly takes on those colorations either falsely, hey, I'm poisonous. No, I'm only pretending to be
Pretending,
false,
yeah.
or to be dangerous.
But they don't take it on, it's just a...
Yeah, they don't take it-
It's
evolution.
Right.
evolutionary,
It's mutation.
but it seems to be almost that these characteristics are
The
universal.
signals work,
Okay.
and so that's why they persist. Because if it works, then that means that you're going to get your genes into the next generation. And it
Yeah.
will be carried on by your grandchildren, your children, hopefully,
The gang.
So,
It would be
yes,
the idea of convergence too. So in other words, that over lots of different species, strategies that work will be perpetuated. And it's likely that some of the same strategies will be perpetuated in different lineages. So that you have among insects some of the same strategies maybe that you have among amphibians. And that maybe even you have among mammals as well. That seems to me continuous with ideas, evolutionary ideas, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you
We
very
have a
much.
question behind you.
So something I was thinking about when you were discussing before about kind of straddling the line as both a researcher and as a communicator to everyone else, do you find yourself ever changing your language depending on who you're speaking to?
Well, I do. I talk to my dogs a lot, and I wouldn't in an academic setting. But I do. I actually try to be pretty careful about my language to myself in any context. I mean, if I say my dog is proud, that's fine with me. But I also gloss it with like, well, this is what I mean by that. Like, they show me this look, and in this context. So I feel like I keep that same posture throughout, except for maybe when I'm at academic conferences and while I'm delivering some lecture, you have to be just have extinguished all of any mentalistic terminology from your talk, and then afterwards everyone approaches me and says, but my dog, I want you to explain the thing that my dog does with the bathtub, and then we talk about that. But in the conference, just in that conference setting or in writing a paper, there's no mentalistic language in it. But every other context, I try to be continuous. Like these words are used, I just want to talk about what they could mean or what we know, how we know or don't know that it's relevant.
Well, I would say virtually the same thing, that when I'm writing for the popular audiences, as opposed, well, even the pieces for Science Magazine, you figure there are going to be general readers who are going to be reading your works. And so I never try to write down to the audience. I always try to write in such a way that you can explain what the scientists have done and just make it perhaps a little more easily understood than having them read the entire scientific paper. And what I try to do in the book is to actually tell stories and to have the scientists are something like characters, and I join them and have them go out in the field with them and describe a setting where they're going to be, say, studying parrots, and why do parrots imitate each other, and what does that mean, and how do you go about studying something like that, and how does that affect our understanding of the evolution of language? But I never write about it in such a way as to suggest that this is something that's either simple or easily done in terms of the scientific work, or that that somehow it's being sentimental, or we're suggesting that the animals are having thoughts or emotions exactly like ours. I suspect that a lot of things that they do in a very basic sense are similar to us, but we, of course, are much more complex. So.
Hi, I'm a painter and also do 3D printing, etc., particularly about animals and animals invading human spaces. So I would put them into these surreal situations. And I read Animal Wise, and I was just wondering if there were any other animals that you had observed that were not written in the book, or if there were any updated information afterwards. And also for the rest of us who are observing animals for other means, for example, artistic means, what do you suggest we look at? Because I go to the zoo a lot, the Bronx Zoo and different zoos in different parts of the world, but we're just looking at their actions, we're drawing the contours. Are there any suggestions? So those two questions, yeah.
Thank you for reading my book. In terms of animals that I didn't write about in the book, the one that I was very sorry, I just ran out of time and didn't have enough time to do a chapter on the octopus mind, but I really wanted to do that one, and just like I said, the deadline was approaching and it was impossible. So those animals are very wonderful. I would think that they would be great to include in your artwork, to go to an aquarium and talk to one of the caretakers of an octopus, and perhaps actually go out and meet one of the octopuses and have them greet you, put their suckers on you, give you a sucker kiss, and so forth. I think that would be quite a wonderful thing to do. And as far as other animals or birds, to me, some of the most exciting work that's being done is actually on birds, and how we know birds are such, they're so much more aware of the world and what we're doing, and they pay attention to us far more than we realize. They're also more artistic probably than any other species. And I'm thinking in particular of animals like the bowerbirds, which actually build structures and decorate them. But even beyond that, they obviously have an aesthetic appreciation because of the way that their plumage looks, the female choice that makes the males look so beautiful, especially in tropical species. So I would look at birds.
Look at birds.
Yes.
Or how about urban animals too? I mean, I would spend a lot of, because especially if you're thinking about invading our spaces, the way you phrased it, like there's so many animals that are around us that we don't look at all, but they're ubiquitous. It won't take you long to find rats and squirrels and pigeons and
bees. So many different species of bees
there's someone
inhabit
studies
New
the
York
ants
City.
and the
New York City is an
crabs
agent
in
of
Broadway.
evolution right now.
Raccoons.
Yeah.
You know, they're ubiquitous.
Possums.
I meant, like, is there a type of framework or how to observe them versus just looking at them? Like, what should we be looking for? Like,
Well, I mean, when I have animal behavior researchers go and look at, well, the first thing is to spend a long time looking. That's one of the things. If you don't have somebody to kind of guide you at what to see, which is the ideal thing, if you can find someone who's studying pigeons, which there are many people, you just have to spend a long time and mark down everything you're seeing, write down everything you're seeing. And soon you'll start seeing patterns. Soon you start noticing some are behaving differently than others, and you watch that one and see what happens to that one. Or you see how they react to people. So if you're watching birds in a median and then they fly up, they start to know the lights and they fly up and down with the lights and so forth. So long-term observation is the way that you start to see it, as opposed to the cursory glance that we usually get.
So you can put out bird feeders. I don't know, do hummingbirds come to hummingbird feeders here in New York City? But that's certainly one of the...
Conceivably.
Yeah. That would be one way to see something that's really wonderful up close, and then the behavior between the hummingbirds, because there's certain species that will keep everybody else away. They're very protective of their territories.
So let me shift focus here for a sec before I take the next question. So often when we talk about animal intelligence or cognitive issues across species, the measure is, oh look, the bee is doing something like me, or the bird has an artistic sense like mine. What I find particularly interesting these days, and it's certainly a highlight of your work, Alexandra, is this idea now that we're actually trying to inhabit their perceptual universe, try to sort of, instead of figuring out what they do like us, what is it that we can do that'll help us understand the dimensions of a perceptual world that they occupy? Smell, for instance.
Yeah.
You get down on all fours and like walk around? Tell me about this.
No, I did that. Because I wanted to know what it's like to be an olfactory creature. And if you live with a dog, you know that they're smelling a lot, and we just don't inhabit that world. And so one of my ways in was to try to smell what they were smelling. But I'm very keen on that sense of what the biologist von Uexküll called the Umwelt, the worldview, or the bubble of perception around each of us and around other species. And I really think that's my primary way of looking at and studying animals at this point, is trying to see what it might be like to be them. And you have to understand their perceptual equipment to do that. How are they perceiving the world? Instead of just coming along and asking questions of like, are they like us in these ways? And even if you are going to ask those questions, you have to be able to understand their perceptual world, because you have to be able to translate the test that we use with humans to the other species. And in a lot of early comparative cognition work, that wasn't done particularly. And so even in some of those early pointing studies, they didn't control for odors initially. In other words, these pointing studies, which were so profound in showing that dogs were doing something that chimps were not, because we're a visual species and we look at the world and assume that dogs are also looking at the same scene the way we are, or bees, or any, of course, none of them are. These studies were all about pointing at one or two upturned buckets and so forth that would have something hidden in it, and seeing if the dog could find the point, find the hidden thing based on the point. And they do the way chimps do not. But initially they didn't control for the olfactory odors. In other words, they just had meat or whatever it is under one and nothing under the other. So you have a dog. I mean, they do also do it if you control for odors. You know, they follow the point. It's a legitimate result. But initially, they weren't thinking in that way. And now much more of the research is thinking that way. And they, oh my goodness, right. Like, we also have to remember that they might be making decisions based on a sense other than our identical perception of the world.
You found something similar when you were writing about parrots and their songs.
Parrots and
their calls, when they slow the call down.
Oh, that part of the study, yeah, that was fascinating actually. I'd gone to Venezuela because I'd had the great fun of getting to meet Alex, the African gray parrot, who Irene Pepperberg studied. And of course, you could ask Alex questions and he would answer you in English. That's not what parrots do in the wild. They're not speaking English. You know, they're speaking their own parrot language. And so researcher Carl Berg is looking at parrotlets in Venezuela, a very small little parrot, and they're calling each other's names. He'd worked out that each parrot had what is called a signature contact call that functions as a name, and one parrot can call another parrot by that name and get a response. They can have something like, he would say, a conversation, at least an exchange of information back and forth. So I was very excited. I thought, wow, I'll go down to Venezuela and I'll hear parrots calling each other by name. Must be a fabulous sound. So I went there, and Carl's out in the field, and the parrots are very hard to see. They're, like I said, quite small. They're the color of a leaf. There was a zooming by. And Carl had banded 100 or so of these birds, and he had certain ones he wanted to get on his microphone and record. And suddenly he's got his mic out and he goes, "There's one of our birds now." And he's calling his name. I thought, how can he possibly know that? You know? And so this bird zips by and making a sound that was something like peep, peep, peep. And Carl's busy getting this on his recorder. And I was sort of standing baffled, and he said, I know what you're thinking. You're really disappointed. He said, that's the sound of a parrot calling another parrot. But he said, there's actually more information in there. We just can't hear it. He said, when I first heard the sound, and I was supposed to be studying it, I thought, that's ridiculous. You know, I'm not studying that. And anyway, if I have to study it, I'll probably figure it out within a year or two. I'll get the cover of Science, and my career will take off. When I met him, he was into about the 8th year of his study. I'm trying to figure out this little sound, peep, because to the parrots, it's not peep at all. I tried, you know, he slowed it down for me so that I could hear every note that they hear, and it was, well, I can't even imitate it. Many notes and long sound. And within that sound, there were a couple parts, a little part of it, which was the name and all this other information. So what are the parrots saying to each other? Well, here's Bob flying home to his wife, Susie, down in the little house there with the chicks and the eggs. They nest in nesting boxes at about 3 feet off the ground. He's zipping along. He's been out harvesting seeds all day long. He's hot and tired. He probably wants sex. She's been down in the house all day long with the kids. She's hot and tired. She wants to eat. So she comes up out of the house. She'll only come up when it's Bob, not Dick, Sam, or Harry. She only comes up when she hears him calling her. And so she comes up out and sits on top of the little nesting box, and he comes along and they have some kind of negotiation. And one time we saw one of the guys come flying in, lands on the house, and she's there, and suddenly he leans over and bites her right on the back of the neck hard. And then they flew off together, and Carl said, wow, they're going to get divorced.
And that was all packed into Pete, right?
Exactly. She's not putting up with that because it's female choice. And so if he wants to have kids, he better be nice to her. She's the one with the house.
I see. So let me thank you for your patience. Go right ahead.
So my question is basically back to the topic of dogs. In general, we've done, this is like mostly recent studies that we've done, but in our recent studies, have we shown that dogs have cultures as well across regions? Like, for example, a dog in Japan might behave in a completely different way than a dog in urban city versus a rural area in the United States, and across different regions, across different languages. Do they understand stuff differently? How do we cope with that kind of?
Well, it's an interesting question because when you talk about, I don't think there's been any work looking at the culture of dogs per se, because what we'd be looking at there are dogs that live together, free-ranging dogs. Not because if you're talking about the dog that lives in a Japanese home versus the dog that lives in an American home, they do have a different culture in a way because their owners have different culture. Exactly. And they're right. But that's, so I wouldn't call it the dog's culture though. I mean, the dog might learn different things and have a different upbringing and speak a different language, respond to different linguistic cues. But that's only because of their environment, not because of something which they generated as a species together. They generated it with that, in interaction with that person. So we wouldn't, in animal cognition, when people are studying the cultures of macaques, of macaque monkeys, or of different communities of birds, they're looking at the animals living with each other. And if in different places they've developed different strategies, and often we do see that. But in this case, the strategy is like respond to your person. That strategy is the same, in these different cultures, even though you'll see a lot of different behaviors as a result of what they've been taught and the interactions they've had.
I see. So my question, just phrasing in a different way, like one of the most common traits that we relate to dogs is their loyalty. So across the board, and would it be more severe in Japan, or would it be more severe in over here? Is it like, does that change across, and does it depend on their interaction with human beings in general, or does it not?
Right. Well, so that's something that hasn't been studied. As far as I know, the measure of loyalty would be interesting. In other words, how would you operationally define loyalty? Like, how do you decide what that is? Yeah. And then you could see, do you have more of it in one context or than the other? You might even see different amounts of whatever we're calling loyalty in different breeds, because it might have to do with responsiveness or independence, for instance, versus dependence. But I don't think it has been operationally defined in our field, and nobody's studied it yet. So there's a research question for you.
Jenny, do you have any insight on this?
The only study that I was thinking about was the one that looked at the street dogs in India. And there, of course, these are dogs who are not living in people's homes, but they depend on people for food.
Right.
And the one difference that they did notice was that the mother dogs were, you could almost say, rather vicious towards their kids, towards their pups. That they, if the food came out and the pups, they try to wean them quite rapidly, the mothers do. And then if someone provides something really important, like a big steak or something, she's not letting her pups have any of it. Not a chance. She will have that wolf down in an instant. So there is a difference in that kind of culture, but those
from
are
an
dogs.
Owned environment.
Not in an owned environment.
Reflections of human beings in general, is that something that we?
Well, no, I wouldn't say it's a reflection of human beings. It's just a reflection of how hard their life is.
I see.
And that there's no guarantee of when the next meal is going to come, and the puppies have to get off on their own very, very quickly, much faster than perhaps puppies in our society.
Yeah, let me follow up on his question though. So the relationship, the cross-cultural attitudes towards animals pets in general is an interesting topic. I mean, as you say,
Yes,
not
it
well
is.
studied.
Yeah.
But certainly the relationship overall between our species and dogs is a very long-standing one, give or take 20,000 years, depending on what genetic evidence you like. So here's my question: who selected who, do you think?
Oh, that is a good question. I mean, I think the theories I think that make the most sense are ones which have a kind of early self-domestication by whatever this proto-dog wolf-like thing was, who was less fearful probably, and therefore more willing to approach people. And then the groups of people in various places who decide to take in or at least suffer the presence of those wolves are the ones who are like the early domesticators. But it would be the wolves who are less fearful of humans, who see humans and their trash, for instance, as a new food source, who would have been the starters of the process potentially. Maybe not, not necessarily thinking ahead. Neither were those early humans thinking ahead exactly. But I think I would say it starts with the wolves.
Yeah. But I mean, are we the center of the story, or are they the center of the story?
They're the initiators, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and they're great for it. They're social social creatures who can have very strong affiliations, lived in family groups, and had a flexibility of behavior that let them be flexible enough to approach this predator and competitor.
Did you have a?
Well, I think that's pretty much what people are saying these days, that it seems to be that the wolves, or some kind of a wolf-like ancestor, came to hang around human camps where people have had maybe a lot of mammoth to eat or reindeer meat to eat. There was one study which showed that actually the dogs at a camp, I think it was in Siberia, weren't actually being given any of the mammoth meat. They were only being given reindeer meat. So that raises some questions about, well, how do you do that? And that suggests that the early dogs or wolf dogs were somehow being corralled or tied up or kept away from the prized meat, and possibly even being used for sacrifices, which is one thing that we forget. But early people kept lots of animals with the intention of sacrificing them. And you still see it in certain villages where people decide that they have a ceremony, they need a number of chickens of a particular color or a sheep or whatever, and they designate certain animals for sacrifice. And if you have a celebration day, at one celebration I was at in Ethiopia where, say, 2,000-3,000 people standing around a lake are all going to have a black chicken to slit its throat and sacrifice it. That puts a certain selective pressure on the chicken as an organism, and it could be that dogs were used in that way because of some of the fossils that have been found that suggests that they were doing something to the skull of the dog after its death, that they may have been using them in some kind of a religious ceremony.
And the desire to get along with us, if that's in fact what it was, I mean, that behavior, that mindset had powerful genetic effect on whatever those things were. I mean, experiment with foxes, I think.
Oh, the fox experiment is a very famous one, which showed that after X number of generations, if you continued to choose foxes that were less afraid of you and bred those foxes together that didn't run to the back of the cage but came forward and greeted the people, and eventually you would end up with an animal that not only would run to greet you and leap in your arms, but began to have many dog-like physical attributes.
Floppy ears,
spotted fur, curly tails, more pushed-in faces, just many of the things that we regard as dog-like.
The cognitive affiliation is a powerful driver.
Yes.
You have a question?
Hello, this is a Twitter question from Marissa Shee, and she asked, have you seen the cheating penguin video that's been going around lately? Do you know?
The cheating
penguin video?
Cheating penguin, yes.
Yes, I haven't. I've been immune from that.
Yes, I saw the cheating penguin video.
Would you share for us?
Well, it's a rather horror story. But there is a penguin, and I believe it's in South America. I'm not sure which colony of penguins, but at any rate, a male penguin comes,
returns.
Right. And his mate during his absence, and I don't know how long he's been gone to sea hunting, but he comes home and his mate has taken up with a new guy. And of course, he's not happy to find this intruder in his burrow. And so they begin to fight. The two males begin to fight, and it's much more aggressive than what you would think that penguins can do, but they really can smack each other with their wings, which don't have hollow bones like most birds have because they fly and penguins don't. So the penguins are bashing each other and then pecking at each other, and they both end up very bloody. And finally, she comes over to choose. Who does she choose? The new guy. And so it is anthropomorphizing, but her first mate's behavior, he looks very dejected, putting it mildly. And he can't believe what's happened, that he's lost not only her, but his eggs, probably. And so he follows them back to the burrow nest. They live in a little underground hole. And tries to again attack this male, and they both end up very bloodied and battered, and finally he just concedes defeat and slinks off, hopefully to find another mate, because there do seem to be thousands of penguins elsewhere, spread out over the landscape.
That sounds like so many Greenwich Village bar fights.
He only wants her, though. He only wants her.
Dan, you have a question?
I do have a question. So this has been really interesting so far, but it's about to get less interesting. But while we've been talking here, a rebellion has been quietly seething on Twitter that our conversation has been pretty dog-centric, and I think that's pretty obvious because you can't. I can't imagine how you could do a controlled experiment with a cat, with a domesticated cat. But
we can give you examples.
Oh, good! I can't wait to hear about that, because not only as the owner of Lenny, the bathtub user, I assume that was political commentary this week. I don't know, but what do we know about the cat Umwelt, and does it support or undermine the sort of stereotype of cat owners that that view cats as somehow intellectually superior, or the cats are more independent? What do we actually know about the cat world?
Yeah. No, I can tell you, just so you know that we're on top of this, that Animal Cognition, which is a very well-respected journal, a certain researcher a while ago did a literature search and found that in this well-respected journal there were 36 articles on dogs and their mind working, and only 3 on the domestic cat, which was about the same number as the cuttlefish, if you just want to know where the pecking order.
Right.
But I think
it would probably be easier to get a cuttlefish and an MRI than a cat. So.
It's not a pecking order. We have to leap to the cat's defense.
So is it that cats are just too cat-like, too feline to be studied, or is there something impenetrable about the cat mind?
But there's nothing impenetrable about the cat mind, but one researcher I spoke to who wanted to figure out if cats could count, and so he set up his experiment. And he had his cats that he was going to test. The cats, of course, had their own idea of how much they wanted to participate. So one of the cats would do the test in the morning one time only. Other cats would only do it in the afternoon one time only. So how many cats can you study? And then you have to get a statistical.
Right. If you have an N of 1.
And it's going to take you a long time to get these data, right? So he said he can't inflict cats on his graduate students, who are usually the ones who end up doing these experiments, because it simply takes too long to get cats to participate. But it's not that you can't investigate their minds, it's just that it's an extra burden of work for the researcher, because they're quite independent.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing dog experiments, like the dogs, well, the dogs are brought in by their owners, and every owner, it's delightful recruiting people for experiments, because people ever want to come in and see it. Then you just tell them something about the dog, and that's the whole reward. And the dog's happy just being there. So it's really great to study dogs. I mean, they're very cooperative, but a lot of my research is just natural observations of dogs, because I want to see what they're doing, not just what they do in this one very limited context where I set up a very simple experiment. And that's what the cat cognition research, that's probably where it will mostly flourish. And it will flourish because we're as interested in cat minds as we are in dog minds. And just because they're not as readily walked into our experiments doesn't mean they can't be investigated. They just can't be investigated with that really simple choice tasks. You point at either bucket and you know what they're going to do. They're just going to look at you.
But I mean, it is a curious admission. I mean, like about 37% or so of the households in the United States have a dog. About 37% of the households in the United States have a cat.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
But we weren't ever doing this research because of the percentages of people who had dogs or cats. It was because of the theoretical question. What kind of cognition exists in other minds, in other creatures' minds? And so, it's been somewhat arbitrary the way research has gone. What are A, we're interested in primates because we're a primate. Oh, B, we're interested in mice and pigeons because we can keep them in cages, right? And starve them and get them to press on levers. That not be because somebody did some analysis and said they'd be the great model. And then now we're doing dogs because, a few people in different places said this would be a great subject to study, and there were some surprising results and good response. So, and it's changing now, right? It's broadening now, but I think that explains the history of why we've studied what we have and why we haven't studied what we haven't.
I think it also takes a really clever scientist, someone who's observing, like you were watching the dogs playing. So I have written about a researcher, Karen McComb, who studied a variety of animals. She's probably most famous for her work on the sounds of elephants and horse behavior. But probably one of her most favorite studies just came about because she is a cat owner, and she found that her cat would make this particular cry that as soon as she heard it, she would get up and feed the cat. There was just no question. She didn't want to hear it again. And so she would get up and feed her cat. And so she began to wonder what was in that sound that made her do that. And she began to ask other people, does your cat have a particular sound that it makes that makes you get up and feed the cat before you feed yourself or your dog or anybody else in the house? And yes, everybody seemed to have a cat that did that. And so then she analyzed the sound. And what she discovered was that the cats, independently of course, had all hit on the same frequency that a human baby makes when it's hungry. And so immediately you are going to feed the baby because you can't stand to hear. It's a bit your program to feed the baby. And so the cats, just very independently, they figured out a sound that's the same frequency and as irritating as can be to your ears. And it will be just the button will be pushed and you will leap up out of your seat and feed the cat. So again, to me, part of it is how attentive are we to our animals, and do they trigger questions that somehow can be answered? And because she's a specialist on the sounds animals make to communicate with one another, she thought there's something in my cat's cry that's getting me to feed it.
I find that wholly convincing, except the part where you say they came across this all independently. I'm sure they had a meeting. Probably in Dan's bathtub. You have a question, sir.
So we've been talking about parrots having names and cats communicating with humans, of course dogs communicating with humans, and as someone who's been listening to both the linguistics community and animal cognition community, I wanted to get your opinions on what we know so far about the different types of animal language, not communication, but particularly something specific enough to be called a language loosely defined, because I think there's a lot of confusion in the public about what qualifies a language, what doesn't, and when we're overhyping things and when we're not.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the big issues in that field is what we call language. And certainly, if we think of language as something that's special to humans, one thing that we are able to do that many, many other species can't do is to imitate other sounds. And we are called lifetime vocal learners. So dogs are not vocal learners. They cannot hear a sound and imitate it. Every once in a while, someone will say, my dog is making this sound like something that I do, or saying hello when I say hello. But it's not like what parrots do. It's not what certain species of bats do. It's not what cetaceans do. It's not what we do. So if we want to look at where possibly other species have language, those are the animals we want to look at. And they may have something similar or parts of the kind of language that we have. That will drive linguists crazy. They really object to the idea of any species other than ourselves having a language. But nevertheless, you do see in birds especially, you see examples of syntax, you see grammar, you see all of the elements, plus especially working with animals such as parrots, which are also, certain species are lifelong vocal learners such as ourselves. They're doing something with their calls, it's not songs, they're doing something with their calls that's very, very similar to language. And I suspect that researchers such as Carl Berg are going to eventually show that it's more language-like than will make some people comfortable. That's the way I would put it.
I hope. Do you have a thought?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in my mind, it's frustrating to hear always about whether animals have language, because, and we do sort of distinguish between language and communication systems. But, I mean, every animal has some kind of rudimentary or complex communication system, and mostly our lack of understanding is due to our lack of investigation, or our lack of understanding how to investigate, or how to break down the sound, or what medium to look at, because it might not be a language conveyed in sound. It might be in smell, or it might be in touch. It might be in vibration. And so, but if we're talking about, does an animal have language like the human animal's language, I would say no. But animals have systems which, I mean, I think we would see it if it were like it. It is going to be different, and it might have some of these things that we think are so important about our language. I don't know if all of you think that syntax is the important thing about what you say, but linguists truly do. They think that's really important. Yeah. And you'll see elements of it. Is it combinational complexity, where you can put words together in different ways? I don't know if we can see that elements of that in some animals. Is it imitative learning, vocal imitation? We'll see examples of that in some animals. So I feel like the question is sort of starts wrong. It's sort of reframed incorrectly. And I would rather go back and say, all right, what are the communication systems? Let's detail them as best we can, as opposed to saying it has to be this set of things to be language.
Well, rats can be tickled and laugh. Whales sing, bowerbirds make sculptures. But what I do is keep time. And sadly, we are at the end of our conversation. And what I want to say is, you both are in a variety of ways helping us all reframe our sense, our perceptual and emotional and intellectual sense of the animals that we share this planet with. And for that, I thank you, and I thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now I hope that you'll unwire yourselves.
Thank you very much for coming. I did want to say something really important.